I want to thank you for joining me for another study in the book of Isaiah. I'll ask, if you will, to be turning to chapter 41. And here in just a few minutes, after we do a little bit of review, we'll pick back up with where we ended last week, beginning looking at verses 11 through 13. Remember that chapter 40 begins the last part of the book of Isaiah. It'll take us all the way through chapter 66. And it's very much more a positive aspect of what is seen. A great deal about blessings, a great deal about future sense regarding a servant who's to come, and events that are all going to transpire as all of that shakes out. So there's some great studies for us here as we look at these chapters. But let's note that the change in tone, if you will, from a deeper, darker aspect of the first 35 chapters to a much more positive flow through the remainder of the end of the book. In chapter 41, we see the overall meaning being the Lord rules. And so very clearly, we're looking at the concept of the sovereignty of God as it relates to the concerns of God's people at that time. Following the comfort and the assurance that's given in chapter 40, then God summoned Judah to recognize him as being sovereign. In other words, he was in control. He was calling the shots. He was the authority. He was the one God in their life. And they needed to remember and to begin to act that way, or act on that understanding, rather than attempting to chart their own course, to look at idols or to look at the alliances with other nations that had characterized their actions for so long before, as seen in the first third or the first section of the book. As we begin looking at chapter 41, the first 4 verses speak of the Lord ruling over the world. And there we find that case for sovereignty being made. He called the people together for judgment in verse 1. He spoke of an unnamed conqueror who was to come from the east. He's introduced in verses 2 and 3 of that chapter. And we're going to learn later that this is a reference to Cyrus, who's the Medo-Persian king, who is going to play such a key role in what God did regarding his people. We'll see him even more as we move into chapters 42 through 45, looking at various aspects in that context. Then in verse 4, God is said to have performed and accomplished the great act of deliverance that is depicted there. When God said, "I am He," it's an honor that only God can claim. Well, then in verses 5 through 16, and this is the section we got into toward the end of our last session, we're looking at the Lord, your confidence, or God as a source of confidence. In verses 5 through 7, the foolishness of idols was once again addressed. In this sense, the nations encourage one another in vain as they try to get each other to take each other's gods. They're all man-made. They're all useless. They're all vain. Then in verse 8, for the first time, we're introduced to the theme that's going to carry us throughout the remainder of the book. In chapters 41 through 48, the word servant appears 13 times in that text, and different contexts are referring to different individuals who are servants. But in essence, we're looking at those who are involved in God's plan to redeem man, to bring man back. And this is going to culminate in that great chapter of chapter 53, and looking at the suffering servant that is portrayed there, clearly Christ and him crucified, being addressed. In verse 9, the phrase, "I have chosen you," speaks of the exalted position of the children of Israel. They were the elect of God. Now, Shackelford quoted McGuigan as saying that Israel is the elect of God. Their trouble was that they thought they were the elite of God. So lessons had to be learned to get the proper perspective. Verse 10, they were told to stop fearing. God's message gave them good reason to be confident. That's seen in the phrase, I am your God. I have chosen you. We're seeing a relationship that was established and provided for by God in that context. And so therefore, they were to be confident, not arrogant, not overconfident, but to put their trust in Him because of who He was and what He had promised them that He would do. Well, now let's look at verses 11 through 13 as we pick up, looking at God being their confidence. Behold, all those who were incensed against you shall be ashamed and disgraced. They shall be as nothing. And those who strive with you shall perish. You shall seek them and not find them. Those who contended with you, those who war against you shall be as nothing, as a non-existent thing. For I, the Lord your God, will hold your right hand, saying to you, fear not, I will help you. We saw a great example of this back in chapters 36 through 39, that historical interlude that involved Hezekiah. Hezekiah was protected. God took care of him, even in a context when it looked like ultimate defeat under Sennacherib. God destroyed 185,000 in one night. God cared for them, provided for them, defeated their enemy. We have very similar language here being spoken of as a reason to be confident. Confident enough to put their trust in Him, staying with our theme. The nations that had come up against them in the past, they're all going to be punished. Shame and dishonor would be seen by them. We've seen the arrogance of Assyria and others like them. We've seen God's children mocked by those nations round about. And here the message is they're going to go down. And not only are they not going to be effective in coming against you, they're going to be shamed. They're going to be disgraced. Israel was small in number. Israel was smaller in might than militaries of those nations around them. But those enemies are going to be defeated. These other nations will become non-existent. The point being made here is this could never have happened due to Israel's own military might. They paled in comparison to everybody else. Remember, Sennacherib himself said, I had Hezekiah shut up as a bird in a cage. In Sennacherib's mind, it was already over. But he fell. Only God could provide this kind of victory. And that's what these people needed to learn. And once they learned that lesson, they would have the confidence to be God's people and give their homage to Him. Look at verse 14. Fear not, you worm Jacob, you men of Israel. I will help you, says the Lord, and your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. Now, the worm word there is a metaphor. The word worm there is a metaphor. Let's make sure we're understanding here. Oftentimes when we think about a worm, we think about something disgusting and nasty, something that we really don't want to touch. But what this is actually referring to as it relates to a worm is the defenselessness of that one. You're looking at something that is hopelessly inferior to the task. That's the way this word is used. It's a metaphor that describes weakness, not their being worthless. It's a word that, it's a context that shows that the people were not to fear, however, in that weakness. The power of God is being shown. The ultimate victory in God is being promised. And now they're to put their trust in God in that weakness. Don't kowtow. Don't murmur and complain. Oh, we don't have any chance. We have no hope. That was why they went to these alliances. They knew they didn't have any hope, but they were looking at their own resources. and their own abilities. And so therefore it was their belief they needed somebody else to help them because of that. God acknowledges that. He referred to them as a worm. They were incapable on their own and by their own merit to accomplish these things. But he said, I'm strong enough, and I promise that I will deliver in that context. The word redeemer is used there. And the concept of redeemer and redeemed, you've got a redeemer and you have the redeemed that are spoken of. One of the best examples that we have of a redeemer that was seen as it relates to blood ties is Boaz in the context of the book of Ruth. A kinsman redeemer. You're looking at Ruth's husband had died. She basically was at the mercy of others as it related to gleaning in the fields or things such as that. But this close relative, Boaz, is one who could step up under that system, under that Old Testament system, and bring her in, marry her in that sense. There was a closer relative that had to be given the first opportunity, and Boaz did so. And that one did not choose to do so, so Boaz did. And we see the book of Ruth ending with a beautiful picture of love. And you see one who's in the seed line of Christ, God working through all of these things. That kinsman redeemer, though, was a major aspect, a major concept under the Old Testament system. But we're going to move this to a more spiritual sense of redeemer and redeemed. God's relationship with Israel is not of blood, but it's one of covenant. Now, as we move into the new system, we're going to have a Redeemer who purchased us with his blood. He redeemed us by paying that price. And so here we see a concept that we are going to be able to see come into a more full understanding as we move into the New Testament. Verses 15 and 16, we're looking at very figurative language. Behold, I will make you into a new threshing sledge with sharp teeth. You shall thresh the mountains and beat them small, and make the hills like chaff. You shall winnow them. The wind shall carry them away, and the whirlwind shall scatter them. You shall rejoice in the Lord and glory in the Holy One of Israel. Who is the them that's being spoken of? The idea is those nations around them. God is promising deliverance through those nations or through his might as it relates to those nations around. But he's going to be working through Israel to accomplish all of this. Bottom line, in a very figurative way, Isaiah's message is that no nation will be able to stand against Israel. But let's remember the context. Let's remember that they have been condemned before because of seeking alliance from others. And let's realize here that these nations will not stand against them, but not because they go find an ally that is strong enough to do so. It's when they put their trust in God that God is going to enable them to stand against any nation that will come down. Look at the language again. It's like a threshing floor and the scattering and the destruction. Israel is going to be victorious if they would only trust in God to accomplish that task. Now, chapter 41, verses 17 through 20. Not only is the Lord there, the Lord rules, the first four verses. Verses 5 through 16, the Lord your confidence. Now, verses 17 through 20 is God's provision or the Lord's provision. Let's read those verses together. The poor and needy seek water, but there is none. Their tongues fail for thirst. I, the Lord, will hear them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. I will open rivers in desolate heights and fountains in the midst of valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water and the dry land springs of water. I will plant in the wilderness the cedar and the acacia tree, the myrtle and the olive tree. I will set in the desert the cypress tree and the pine and the box tree together, that they may see and know and consider and understand together that the hand of the Lord has done this, and the Holy One of Israel has created it. This section, again, is somewhat figurative. Water is spoken of quite often, but something other than water is going to be seen when we see the fulfillment of that. As a matter of fact, it's more comprehensive. You've got water being addressed, but also you're focusing on what water produces or what water enhances as it relates to their provision. So man's needs. What are some of man's greatest needs? Top of the list is fuel, that's food, and water. Without those things, man will not last long on this earth. But here's the point again. Comfort in verses 5 through 16. Now they're to be encouraged, but they're to be encouraged because of what God promises to provide for them as it relates to their needs. Man is unable to do these things on his own. When we look at planting seed today, we look at hunting animals today or raising animals, domesticated and for slaughter. All of those things are God's creation. Man on his own can only collect or gather what God provides through all of those things. Water being provided is mentioned here, but it speaks of more needs than that. Water is vital, but water in and of itself is not something we can live off of for very long. There are other great needs that God provides as well. When you look at the trees, notice a number of things they're able to provide for us. You see fruit, you see leaves, you see the wood as it relates to construction. You're looking at seed that will reproduce and all of these things. But you're looking at a lot of things that are addressed here that man needs that God is providing. Great benefits are seen from what the water provides in other areas. Hence, he moves into the trees as we move down through these verses. When they saw the trees, they needed to remember who had provided them. As we have our food on our table, as we're able to go and buy groceries, we need to understand God's provision being involved in all of this. God blessing us. James says he causes the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. Everybody is benefited because of what God produces naturally. But if we're going to take this to a different place, we're going to understand the spiritual blessings that God provides for us as well. As we seek to make application of ourselves. Yes, we get the same water. We get the same food. We breathe air. We're privileged to have jobs. We have homes to live in. We can buy the clothes that we need. But as we look at every one of those, may we never fail to thank God for our being able to have the things that we need. Well, now we're going to shift back to idols for a moment, because verses 21 through 24, you've got a challenge to idols. Present your case, says the Lord. Bring forth your strong reason, says the King of Jacob. Let them bring forth and show us what will happen. Let them show the former things, what they were, that we may consider them and know the latter end of them, or declare to us things to come. Show the things that are to come hereafter, that we may know that you are gods. Yes, do good or evil, that we may be dismayed and see it together. Indeed, you are nothing, and your work is nothing. He who chooses you is an abomination. This seems out of place. Why go from talking about trees to challenging the idols themselves? Now, God is not acknowledging the existence of these idols. He's speaking to them because the people believe that they actually exist. God knows them for what they are. They're trees, they're rocks, they're something man has made. And I believe the tie to this is that here we have God who provided the trees, who provided all of these things for us. And what does man do? Man cuts down that tree, he carves an image into a piece of wood, and then he sets that piece of wood up and he blesses it for giving him his many blessings. The foolishness of that is being characterized over and over through the Old Testament. What sounds interesting here is that God, in a very symbolic way, invites these idols to present evidence as to the ability to explain historical things and predict the future. Does it sound familiar here? Does this not sound like Elijah standing before the prophets of Baal and asking them these questions? Where is your God? Remember, the challenge was to set up this pile of wood and to call on their gods to bring the fire down to consume it. And when the prophets of Baal tried to get their God to come down, Elijah took a very sarcastic approach. Where's your God? Maybe he's on a trip. Maybe he was asleep. Maybe he's relieving himself. Maybe he's going to the bathroom. The whole idea knowing that those idols did not exist. Again, God is not referring to these as legitimate gods. He's using terminology they would use. Look to your gods, these that you worship. I'm asking these questions of them. He knew that they could do nothing, but he was also exposing their inability. Only God can do those things. So now, verses 22 to 24, God proposed a test for those who believed in idols. If they could predict the future, then they could depend on them. If that tree or that rock that you carved a face in, if you can look at that God and ask you to predict the future, or you ask it to predict the future, it predicts the future, then you can believe in it. But he's just using a method that continually shows they would be gods if they had that capability. If they could actually produce what the people claimed that they did. Remember, go all the way back to the Exodus. When you look at those 10 plagues, you're looking at plagues that were on physical things, but they were against the gods that supposedly were involved and cared for the Egyptians in those things. There were over 70 gods themselves in Egypt at that time. And it was what men looked to provide for them, fertility or food or seasons or all of these things. Now here you've got God drawing on the same mindset, those people that believe those idols exist, and he's challenging them. But in that challenge, he's showing that they had no abilities whatsoever. Why did they have no ability? Because they were man-made. They were creations of men. No matter how man viewed them, they were still just a tree or just a rock that was sitting there. You could call it a god all day long, but it didn't make it a god. But God was trying to get these people through Isaiah to understand the foolishness of the idolatry that plagued them. Now, let's remember why this is so significant. When Isaiah wrote in 740 BC, it's going to be less than 20 years before the 10 northern tribes of Israel were carried away into Assyrian captivity. The reason? idolatry. One prophet after another was rejected. When Isaiah turns to Judah, Judah's going to follow suit. It's going to be just over 100 years, 120 years before that happens. 722 for Assyria, beginning in 606 for Babylon. Same problem, idolatry, man putting their trust in their idols rather than God. When we read these prophetic messages, we are awed by the profound nature of these books. These are powerful. We ask, how could they not learn? How could they reject God after having this kind of evidence provided for them? Brethren, we don't need to go there. No, we may not have an idol in our house, but we live in a country today that has raised idols up that we look to for God for difficulty. We look to in times of difficulty rather than looking at God. We need to learn the same message as it relates to those things. Money doesn't deliver us. Numbers in a congregation don't necessarily make the congregation strong. We look to ourselves and pat ourselves on the back for accomplishments when we need to be acknowledging God for the many good things that happen in our lives. And as individuals and as families and heads of families, we need to learn the lesson to be thankful, realizing that everything we have because God has provided it. We've got about 3 minutes left. Let's see if we can't finish this chapter up. Verses 25 through 29, only God can predict the future. I have raised up one from the north, and he shall come. From the rising of the sun he shall call on my name, and he shall come against princes as though mortar, and the potter treads clay. Who has declared from the beginning that we may know, and former times that we may say he is righteous? Surely there is no one who shows, surely there is no one who declares, surely there is no one who hears your words. The first time I said to Zion, look, there they are. And I will give to Jerusalem one who brings good tidings. For I looked, and there was no man. I looked among them, but there was no counselor, who, when I asked of them, could answer a word. Indeed, they are all worthless. Their works are nothing. Their molded images are wind and confusion. So he's summing up what he's saying about idols. And he says those idols can't tell the future. Only God knows what's going to happen. Now, we're looking here at verse 25. We're introduced to an amazing prophecy in this passage. The one from the north is going to be seen as Cyrus, the Medo-Persian king. Now, remember, we said that Medo-Persia was more east, but let's also remember how they traveled. If you look at that Fertile Crescent, when you look at attacks that came in, or you're looking at those who come to help, they came around and came in from the north, and that's what's being addressed here. We know that it's Cyrus because that's where we're going in chapters 42 through 48, or through 45, in dealing with him. Chapter 44, verse 28, chapter 45, verse 1 are going to be very much more specific about those very things. He will call on my name, may indicate that he would pronounce God's name as he issued that edict, allowing those exiles to come home. You might jot down Ezra chapter 1, verses 2 through 4 in fulfillment of this. Isaiah indicates that others will not be able to stop him. As indicated earlier, only God can predict future events. That's 26 through 28. The idols and their priests had no answer for the questions that God gave them. Verse 29, God used 4 words to describe those pagan gods: false, worthless, wind, and emptiness. In the Hebrew language, where these words were used in the sentence, puts emphasis on those words. They were at the first of the sentence. And that's how the Hebrews maybe put an exclamation point on something. Oswald, these statements are like the blows of a hammer, driving home the truth of an idol's ineffectiveness. Thank you again for your interest in the study of this word. Thank you for your patience as we move slowly through a powerful book. I hope that you're gaining faith, gaining greater understanding through the study of that word and seeing our symbol and need to apply it. Until next time, we'll start picking up in chapter 42 next time. Until then, God bless you.